Hello, everyone. Welcome to the November 21st edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk meeting. I believe this is the 63rd call, which absorb that for a second. That's a lot of calls. That's a lot of YouTubes to watch. Anyways, my name is Richard Brown. I am the head of community development at MakerDAO. We talk about governance and we talk about risk in these calls. And we're going to dig into both of those in depth, but we also talk about, or we have talked about, and we should be talking about more than just that. And we have some special guests joining us today from our technical teams. And we're going to start, we've experimented with this in the last couple of calls and it's worked out swimmingly. So we're going to keep on doing that, where we have representatives that are from the factory floor. I don't know if that is a great compliment as I intended it to be, but these are the system architects and they have deep insight into what the protocol does, and they're going to be joining us to give us some insights into recent events and talk about some important issues that we need to deal with that are time sensitive in the ecosystem. We're going to hear from the risk team to talk about parameters and how we deal with those in this brave new world that we live in. And then we're going to hear from Vishesh, who will give us the state of the pegs. Haha, I just renamed your segment. We have 2 pegs now. What are we going to do? Oh my God. All right, but I'm going to talk first about, I do some brief speechifying and talk about some philosophy, because we have some things we need to deal with, and some processes we need to comprehend, and so other things we need to internalize. So I'm going to kick it off, and then we can see if there's any questions about that. Oh, yeah, sorry, and I forgot to mention, there's a lot to go over, and as Matthew pointed out, there was a fairly large event that occurred recently, the launch of MCD. So I'm sure there's going to be some questions about that as well. So we'll be hanging out after the top of the hour and answering just any rando questions that people might have. In the meantime, though, if you have something you want to ask, feel free to type it in the chats, or if you have access to a microphone, feel free to interrupt us. This is not a presentation or a live stream. It's just it's a meeting, a business meeting like any other. So if you have something you need to say, feel free to say it. All right, so here's what I want to talk about, and it touches on what I just mentioned. We do live in a brave new world here. We have MCD has launched. We have an upgraded protocol. We have 2 universes we need to deal with. We have SCD and we have MCD. We have SIGN. We have DAI. And we need, what's most important to us in this venue is how do we govern and de-risk a system that looks like that. And here's my answer to you: I do not know, but it's not my job to tell you. It's our job to figure it out together, and that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to list out a bunch of things that I think that need to be addressed, and then maybe offer some solutions about how we can go about figuring out the answers to some of these questions. This launch of MCD, I frequently use this analogy that launching stuff in the crypto space, or actually in any software space, we're not all that special, but to be successful, to truly execute and to make a difference, you need to run a marathon. And when that marathon ends, you have to run a race. And then when that race ends, you have to run another marathon. And we hit the finish line on the old MCD launch. It's launched, and now it's either marathon or race time. We need to figure out which one of those things are. So there's a lot of work ahead of us. We need to start. Well, we don't need to. Let me tell you what I think we should do. When major launches like this happen, it's important to make sure that we don't grandfather in a lot of processes and procedures and policies and assumptions that got us to this point, and assume that they're going to work in the future. And I think that most of the people who have been following what we do here closely might agree that it took a lot of work and a lot of coordination and a lot of reconfiguration and iteration to get us to a point where this community was comfortable with playing with the stability fee lever in single collateral DAI. And that was one lever. It's the only lever we had available to us. If you want to leave off the debt ceiling for a minute. We came to an understanding of what we do with that lever and how it affects the markets. And we looked at graphs, and then we moved the lever some more, and we did some votes, and we looked at graphs again. That the world that we live in right now is an order of magnitude more complicated than that. We need to understand how to maintain the psi peg, the DAI peg. We need to understand what the DSR does for us as a policy tool. We need to figure out how debt ceilings need to be managed. We came up with a plan to allow the interim governance facilitator to maintain a buffer in the debt ceiling. That's presumably, maybe, I don't know, you guys need to decide. I'm not sure whether that's going to work in this new world. We have 2 different debt ceilings, or potentially 3. Cyrus can correct me. That need to be managed across different collateral types, and those need to respond to specific market pressures, and they need to be used as a lever to incentivize the migration process. So just maintaining a number, make number bigger, make number smaller, might not be as sophisticated a tool as we need right now. And either way, that was set to expire when MCD launched, and MCD is launched, so we need to come up with a different idea. So I just want to set the stage for the level of complexity that we have to deal with here, and how that level of complexity imposes what I've been saying over and over and over again for the last couple of weeks on internal meetings, is operational overhead and governance overhead. There's work that is required to make sure that these numbers are understood, that they're balanced correctly, that they're presented to the community and to the ecosystem in ways that it's capable of understanding, and that people have the time and opportunity to move these levers as appropriate, and also that we present enough avenues for people to determine whether the effects of those levers were the ones that we anticipated. And that's one of the things that I want to talk about too. We moved the stability fee on a weekly basis. And I think what I would like for the community to consider is we have empirical evidence about we should have enough empirical evidence about whether that worked or not, and how often it worked, and what movement. Anyway, I don't want to dig into all the different parameters here, but I'm concerned that weekly tweaking of the stability fee might not always have moved the needle, and we don't quite understand what the lag time is between changing stability fees and seeing something happen in the ecosystem. So I encourage the community to take a pause to try and evaluate what kind of, well, actually, these are the segue. So this is where I would like to kick off a new initiative, because these are the grandfathered issues that I was speaking about earlier, where we're coming into the world of MCD. The world of MCD is different. The processes that we have available to us are weekly cadences, incremental rate, exponential rate stepping, and a poll on Monday and a vote on Friday. I want us to very deeply consider that, consider whether that's the system that's going to get us through the next weeks and months, and if so, that's great. If not, how do we improve things? And in order to improve things, we need to coordinate some of this efforts. And so what I am going to do, pinky swear immediately after this call, is review some of these thoughts. How do we audit the governance system that we have? How do we find out what the pros and cons of it are? What are our wins and failures of the past? And what do we need from a new governance system? And set up a working group where we can start aggregating some of these ideas and collecting some of the ideas that we've already been presented with that might have got lost to the sands of time or to lengthy chat logs. So let's try and figure out the ideas that we had, the ideas we have for improvement. Let's get a forum thread going. Let's potentially set up a working group. Let's start creating some bridges between the community and the foundation. And let's make sure that we're all working together to figure out what the next steps for governance are going to look like. I think I am going to potentially leave it there. So if you're interested in governance, if you have ideas about how to improve it, if you want to be involved, please join us and help us figure out how to improve the system. And I think that, yeah, David brought up a point that I had it on my list of things to talk about. And so if you need some incentive to help us join this initiative, all you need to do is look at the poll for this week's size stability fee, and you'll find that somebody voted with 950 Maker, and they set monetary policy for us. So if you want to live in a world where somebody with 950 Maker is in control of the system, then maybe the system we have is fine. Sure, yeah. David pointed out that it's only a signal, but regardless, this also raises some other questions about the continuous approval voting, because continuous approval vote is a roll-up of all the polls that occurred during the course of that week. So if we determine that we need to do something with the DSR that people like, and something with the size stability fee people don't like, and something with the die stability fee people are undecided about, we're going to run into a situation where it's very difficult to get these executive votes ratified. We could run into situations where we have a significant number of weak executives, which could potentially spread the voting maker across some abandoned votes, and then. So we can figure out all kinds of risks. But we have a lot of issues that we need to address in the governance system, and I will, like I said, be pointing out or starting up an initiative in the forums to begin to address that. The segue here, though, is that I'd like to actually. Cyrus, I was going to immediately dump all this onto your lap to offer us some suggestions, because we have these short, mid, and long-term goals that we need to achieve in governance. Short term is figuring out what do we even pull on this week and next week, and what evidence do we use to make those decisions. All of those things are very complicated questions, but we also have some special guests here. So I'm going to hand it off to them, either Wouter and or Mariano, or they're going to tag team, or one or the other will be giving us a discussion from the technical perspective of some issues that we talked about in the community call this week, and have been talking about in the chat, that are related to a few topics. One of them is close to my heart, which is the transition of maker authority, and some other last minute fixes that we need to address. So Mariano, are you going to take it away, or is it Wouter? Oh, there we go. Somebody's got the slides.
I'll be louder.
Yes.
All right.
All right,
Wouter.
Thank you, Rich. So if everyone can see this, I'll try and get this full screen. There we go. Okay. So yeah, I'm glad to give the first MCD technical update for the governance and risk calls. I think this is something that might happen more often in the future, because unlike single collateral die, multi-collateral die is quite a complex system that is very modular, and it requires some level of maintenance, and we definitely would want to extend it and add new features to it. So yeah, that is it comes with more decentralization, so it's something that we will be able to look into in the coming weeks. But for this first segment, we really want to focus on a few things that still need to be done in order to properly finalize the setup that we currently have. So we'll be talking about three things. One is something that already was presented on the community call as well. So this is the MKR authority transfer. And this will be done in two parts, and we'll discuss what the two parts are, and the first part that we would be doing very soon. Then there is a flopper patch that we need to discuss. And the third element is the single collateral die MKR Oracle update that we want to execute. After that, we'll have...
Can I jump in for a quick sec? The flopper is the debt auction. I'm not sure the community is familiar with the technical terms. So
yeah, sure. We will discuss it in more detail. So yeah, and then we'll have a look at the next steps, and at the end there is time for Q&A. So let's get started. Okay, so the MKR authority transfer part one. This one is really needed to finalize our MCD deployment. This is something that ideally we would have done in one go when we initially deployed the system. But because of all the complexities involved and the time constraints, this is one that we pushed out a little bit and are ready now to finish. So we split it up in two parts, and the first step that we'll do really is a last preparation that we need before handing over the MKR authority to the decentralized governance layer. So as members of the community know, the MKR's token that we currently have has an owner, an authority, and currently that authority is the multisig of the Maker Foundation. In single collateral DAI, that was fine because single collateral DAI didn't need the authority to mint MKR as it used the path mechanism. But now that the original design has been deployed, the MKR minting actually happens to make sure that the system remains solvent. So we do need to give the minting authority to the flopper auction, and as Cyrus mentioned, so a flopper auction really is it's a debt auction, and it kicks off when the system debt hits a certain threshold. So system debt might accrue for two reasons. One is if there are liquidations that do not cover the DAI that was generated against that particular vault, then the difference is added to the system debt. And second is our new feature, the DAI savings rate, which also takes from the surplus debt buffer from the system. So that one too adds to it. As I mentioned, so this one kicks off when a certain threshold is hit, and currently the threshold is configured at 50K DAI. And what the flopper auction does, it sells off newly minted MKR for DAI. And yeah, with that extra DAI that it collects, that makes the system solvent again. We do not expect flopper auctions to happen soon, but well, it is something that we expect to work, obviously, just as a part of the system that we delivered. So we definitely need to finalize this, and we definitely want it to be ready by the time when our exchange partners and integration partners will start their migrations, because currently we have a steady flow of CDPs and SAI migrating, but it's mostly individual users at this point. So what we will do is, as I mentioned, give that flopper auction the authority to mint MKR, but that doesn't mean that the multisig also loses the authority to, for example, control the MKR contract. And that is what part 2 will be about. But part 2 is really an iconic moment for the community, because this is the big leap towards more decentralization and our roadmap of gradual decentralization. And that's why we will spend a lot more time talking about it. And that will be on the call for next week. And from an operational point of view, this also plays out well because this is a very critical operation. And yeah, we want to do it gradually so that we can monitor everything and make sure that the first part has been executed correctly before we do the second part. So that's our first update. The second one is a patch of the system, and also applies to the flopper auction. And so about this one, I want to say that's why I mentioned that the segment of technical updates might be a recurring one, because of the complexity of the MCD system. When we add functionality, when we want to do improvements, when we need to do patches, that would be typically something that needs to be rolled out and then voted in with the executive vote. So what is the issue that we want to patch? The issue occurs when there is a very specific condition, and the condition is that the debt auction, so the flopper auction, is active, and at that very moment, the emergency shutdown is triggered in the system. Doesn't matter how the emergency shutdown is triggered. It could be through the emergency shutdown module or through an executive vote. But if the debt auction is active at the time and the emergency shutdown is triggered, then there is a an issue in the system where the winning bidder at that moment, they would be unable to have their staked DAI refunded. So once again, the flopper auction sells off MKR for DAI. And if you are bidding, then you basically lock in your DAI that you want to bid in the system. And if you win, then the system keeps your DAI and gives you the MKR. If another bidder overtakes you, then it just sends back your DAI. And the intended behavior is that if the emergency shutdown is triggered, that the DAI is also sent back. But that one, that's where the issue currently occurs. Yeah, and the first part there, so currently it actually isn't an issue precisely because the flopper auction is still deactivated with the authorization. So what will the patch do? We will replace the flopper contract with a new version before that we authorize it. So before the issue has even the chance of occurring. The change is an extremely minimal one. I won't go into the technical details, but it is one method call, the move method, that we are replacing with another call, the suck call. Yeah, that will solve the issue. It will then correctly credit the DAI to the last bidder as a refund when emergency shutdown happens. And as I mentioned, the change is minimal, and the formal verification of that new module is currently ongoing. So timing, why do we need to do this now? I think this is pretty obvious. So we are enabling the flopper auction because we need to complete the functionality of the system. And obviously we want to enable the patched version now that we have the chance to do that. The one thing that we also will take care of is that we will inform our integration partners, because some of them might already have integrated with the existing flopper auction contract. There are no backward compatibility issues because if they are connected to the old contract, the only thing that would happen is that once the flopper auction kicks off, and that might be, as we mentioned, probably not soon, then they will just not receive that auction. So in terms of impact, that is minimal. The second update is the single collateral DAI MKR Oracle update. So what is the issue here? This is an optimization really. So the precondition is that we have a volatile MKR price, and this didn't used to be the case, but with the migration that is currently going on, this becomes more likely. And there needs to be a widespread on the MKR SAI market. And in these conditions, when CDP owners pay their stability fee, they may actually experience more slippage than usual. If the slippage is larger than 5%, then there is a safety feature in the system that will make the transaction fail. Now, the reason for this is a timing issue. And once again, this is a technical detail, but the way that the MKR Oracle in the single collateral DAI system is configured is with the Oracle security module that we are also using in multi-collateral DAI. And the Oracle security module introduces a delay in the price signal, but that delay is, since it's out of sync with the market price, might actually add to the slippage, and that's the part that we want to improve on. So the patch would be to simply remove the OSM module from the MKR Oracle. Our improved understanding of the system now is that we really don't need that module, and yeah, the impact will be a pure improvement. The timing, so we definitely want this in place as soon as possible because we want to facilitate smooth migration of CDPs. Yeah, preferably once again, we have it in place before the exchanges and the integration partners start enabling their migration features. Okay, so what are the next steps? The three updates that I talked about, they will be detailed to a much larger extent in the forum posts that we will make. Two of them, I believe, we can post in about an hour after this call. The Oracle one will follow soon after. And then the team will be available to reply to questions and comments in the forum thread. And of course, as is the crypto way, we will make the spell code available for inspection so that everyone can see what the actual changes will be. Yeah, it's important to mention, so there are only two of these changes that actually require to be added to the executive vote. One is the MCD flopper patch, so the replacement of the current flopper auction with the patched one. And the other one is the MKR Oracle update. The first item that I mentioned, so the transfer of the MKR authority doesn't require an executive vote. And the reason is that we're not changing anything in the system, we're giving authority to the system to do something. And yeah, you can always do that. It's up to the system to actually use that authority or not. So that's the reason why you don't need an executive vote. Yeah, and then next week, as I mentioned, we will further discuss the next step in decentralization with part 2 of the MKR authority transfer, which we're all very excited about. Okay, so that was it. I saw that there was a lot of activity in chat, so let me have a look.
One question about transferring of that authority. Is there, in effect, the undo equivalent? If it gets handed over to the chief completely, is it possible to then allow the multi-sig to go back to the foundation if needed? Yeah,
so the way that the authority works really is, currently the multi-sig can call the private functions, you could say, and that entire authority is transferred to the system. And the way that the DS chief architecture works is that you can call really any function that is available in the system with that authority then. So that includes transferring the authority of the MKR token back to another party, should the community want that. So obviously that change would have to go through an executive vote.
Matt Lucas, you had a question. Do you have access to a microphone, or you want me to read it up for him?
I do, yeah. I was just asking how it was found, the testing process. I think Sarah referred to Kenton being the one to find it. I was just curious, like, why this wasn't caught earlier in the other testing. I mean, it seems like it's totally patchable and not a major threat to anything, but I'm just curious why it wasn't caught earlier.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question.
Want me to answer?
Yeah, yeah, go ahead, Marian.
So one of the things is that our
You're a little quiet, Mariana.
I am?
Yeah.
How about now?
You sound distant.
Really?
But I hear
emotionally, just audio.
We hear you though.
Okay. The formal verification is only as good as the specs we write, and this was pretty much like a weird edge case. It wasn't found via formal verification. It was found via good old just testing on a Coben testnet. But since it was like a big edge case, it was found fairly late in the process. So
yeah, so the combinations are it's because of the specific precondition mostly, right? This is the wrong slide. This one.
We are going to do a postmortem, and we're doing a K. So runtime verification is helping us with modeling the whole system as in the K framework. This will allow us to have the system and simulate running over months in a few hours, and we can find more of this stuff, which I don't expect we do, but for updates later on, we can simulate them beforehand.
And so part of the testing, the way that we test or have tested is to generate random transactions, a lot of random transactions on the Covent testnet deployment, and then, for example, test through the emergency shutdown feature. And we were a little bit unlucky in this one because we had the flapper and flipper auction active while we triggered emergency shutdown, but this one was missing. So yeah, that's why we only discovered it later on.
Got it, thanks.
Other questions?
I'm not seeing anything that wasn't addressed in the chat itself.
I think there was one from Mitote about do we still need an OSM multi-collateral DAI? So I think it's kind of important, I guess, to clarify, right, what the purpose of the OSM is, right? So the OSM is ultimately there to stop an Oracle attack, right? So if we notice that there is an Oracle attack, right, we have this delay period in order to react and either freeze the price feed or kind of do an emergency shutdown of the system, right? So it's a protection mechanism. In single collateral DAI, like the reason that removing the OSM doesn't really increase the attack surface is that if you are a malicious actor who has compromised the feeds, right? It is much more profitable to manipulate the ETH price Oracle than it is to manipulate the MKR price. So the OSM here doesn't actually increase the risk that significantly in single collateral DAI. Now in multi-collateral DAI, this is kind of a different story, right? So fees are paid in DAI instead of in MKR. So multi-collateral DAI doesn't even use a MKR price oracle. But the reasons for the other collateral types needing an OSM is exactly the same, right?
All right, thanks for that, Nick. We have a question. I'm hesitant to even try and pronounce this because I don't think it's supposed to be pronounced. Journey Jamal. That's your new name. Herne. Actually, I need you to get on the mic to tell me that one. All right. Yes.
I see the question.
You do
Other
have
plans?
You want to read out the question for us, please? Herne, was that you that you served?
So yeah, I'm Yarne. So I'm just if you know if there are any plans to have like issues like issue number 1, you know, that you change that the changes are transparent.
Yeah. So that's a good question. It's a little bit different, right, than in traditional software development. So obviously, because it's a fairly, well, we have an immutable blockchain, so the only thing we can do is actually add modules or replace them, and then set the system parameters. But we will have a MIPS process that we also briefly touched on in the previous community call. And this is a maker improvement proposal process that will be very similar to the EIP and BIP processes, with a formal flow where the proposals for changes in the system they will have a number, they will be recorded, they will be discussed with the community and the forum. And then as we reach consensus, then they will move on to the implementation phase and be deployed ultimately through an executive vote. And yeah, if there is a need for a patch, then that will be described probably in the same system, but obviously the process will be slightly different. But that's another thing. So we talked last community call about YMTD really is a starting point towards more decentralization, and that is one of those elements to set up that process and to have a very transparent process around the changes that are made to the system.
All right, thanks for that, Wouter. Thanks for the update as well. Lots of big things afoot, and I'm sure there's going to be more questions once some of these things sink in a bit. Look forward to the forum posts that do deep dive into each one of these changes. Show up for the executive tomorrow, which will help us implement them and further secure the system. At the top of the hour, I talked about some of the challenges that we're facing with the new world that we live in. And I tossed out a bunch of questions and talked about a working group that we're going to have to deal with those or answer some of those things. But we have some very short-term things we need to understand, and it's how to manage those levers that we have available to us. So I want to hand it off to Cyrus from Risk, and we can talk about some of the options we have on the table right now. Cyrus, it's all yours.
Cool, thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about governance over the next few weeks. We've got a few different interesting things. Oops. All right, so just a few statistics to start off with. DAI supply in the first 3 days has already hit 14 million. The size supply has been reduced from 101 roughly to about 92 million, which kind of implies that we're also seeing some fresh DAI generation as well. It's not just a strict migration. The DAI savings rate lockup has been a little bit anemic, probably less than what most of us expected. So, where's that, probably roughly like 6%. And we can talk about kind of the implications of that a little bit later. But what's been kind of, I think, most pleasing is that both the SAI price and the DAI price have been fairly stable, really just hovering close to $1 for both of them. So I think that's been really cool to see. I think overall we can sort of characterize these first 3 days as obviously very successful. In a lot of sense, we don't have enough data, or not enough time has elapsed for us to draw any super meaningful conclusions, but it's certainly good to see this kind of stability and traction in just the first few days. Now, as I'm sure you guys have all heard a million times by now, we have an enormously large amount of new levers to deal with for governance. We have the DSR, we have the old stability fee and the old debt ceiling. We have the new stability fees plus a global stability fee parameter. We have debt ceilings, auctions, and a whole host of system parameters. This is a significant increase in complexity, and as I'm sure many people in our chat have been feeling like this as of late. We've actually had some really good conversations in our Rocket Chat the past few days, and a lot of good discussion, and a lot of smart people in there. So please feel free to chime in if you're interested. I think one of the first key things we need to tackle is how we're going to structure the new polls. For those of you who are newcomers, we don't like to just kind of create the polls as we see fit internally. We have somewhat of a process in place to gather consensus from the community on what these polls might look like, what the options, what the increments are like. Many aspects of the polls are customizable to the community. I'll let Rich talk about that a little bit later. But that being said, I'm going to talk about a few different options that we could use for the polls, and also feel free to propose other variations as well, but I think these should hopefully hit the main types. I'm also going to separate debt ceilings at the end, because debt ceilings don't necessarily need to be a weekly poll right now. And I think we had an experiment where they were conditional just a few weeks ago, and I think that seemed to work out pretty well. But I'll come back to that. So in terms of the monetary policy, we could do it extremely basic and just have a poll for each of the 4 main parameters, the 3 stability fees and the DSR. Or we could combine the 2 MCD stability fees and keep ETH and BAT the same. I think this is probably my favorite, because I don't think that we need to really deal too much with the risk premiums with either collateral, but especially with BAT right now. We'll get to that over the next few weeks, but just in these early days.
Sorry, is that because they're so highly correlated, or because the volume of BAT is so low?
Mainly because based on the DAI generated from BAT, 1 or 2% deviation annually is completely negligible in terms of risk to the system. The debt ceiling is really what we'd be more interested in here, and that's already set extremely low. So just for convenience sake, I think we should keep ETH and BAT the same, which is the same rationale as we had for the launch parameters. So this option would allow us to kind of keep tinkering with SCD, MCD, and the DSR as well. But if that is too much complexity, we could actually still kind of combine this lower, and we could do 1 stability fee package where we keep the rate differential between single collateral DAI and multi-collateral DAI constant. It was set to 1% in the launch parameters. Based on the results of this week's stability fee poll, this differential is probably already not going to remain. But even if they turn out to be the same, we could. It's not inconceivable that we keep all the stability fees the same up or down, and then just also tinker with the DSR. Obviously, if the pegs deviate a certain way, we'd want to do something specific with SCD and MCD, but today we're not facing that issue right now. The peg is stable, and I'm guessing until the exchanges and the secondaries and we see a bit more traction, I think for simplicity's sake, this could also be an option, and just reduces us down to 2 polls. And then down in the future, we could actually combine this all into a monetary policy package poll. And this is something I think actually we might get to in the next few months. Basically, if you can set the risk premium separately and assume that they're constant, then that spread between the DSR and the stability fee would remain constant as well. And you would just change the overall level of rates across the system. This is something that I'll talk more about next week, because I think it's actually pretty interesting. This is also probably not appropriate for the current migration governance, but something to keep in mind is that we have a lot of flexibility here. And all right, and then debt ceilings. I think the migration is a bit too slow for us to have to worry about it for this very next executive poll. Obviously, that things can change rapidly if the migration gets going. And we did have a plan in the launch parameter proposal, and it was essentially to lower the SCD debt ceiling as we increase the MCD ETH one. And of course, keeping a buffer in place for SCD just in case new SI needs to be generated there. And then I think bat should, in my opinion, stay somewhat constant. So the debt ceiling for SCD is already almost 30 million below its ceiling. So conceivably, we could put out a poll to start lowering this if we wanted to. Yeah, we can discuss that. We should probably discuss that in the forums. But yeah, all this flexibility leads to a bunch of questions. Basically, how do we actually know what any of these parameters should be? Historically, we had been doing things very reactionary, right? We would just increase or decrease stability fee based on the DAI price, and it was very deterministic. And that's really no longer the case. And I think the meme we have to keep hitting on over the coming months is that governance needs to learn to start being more proactive. We have significant new tools that can help us achieve our goals, but we also need clarity on what exactly it is we are trying to do. It's not so clear cut anymore, especially with migration. So there's a lot of talks in the forums about how do we increase the pace of migration, how, what would need to be, what kind of changes need to be made. Of course, increasing the DSR is one option to incentivize sign migration. Some other suggestions on how to do it even quicker. And the point I'm trying to make is that these decisions have, they're not so automatic, they're not so deterministic, and they have pretty serious implications. So certain people have suggested, for example, why don't we raise the SCD stability fee? And I don't think that they're necessarily considering the ramifications of such a decision. And I'll talk about that in a second. So I think we should start to define some of our goals for migration. These are just kind of my opinion. I'm not trying to impose these on the community, but obviously we want the community to switch over. I think we should make sure the user experience is good, meaning not increasing the SCD stability fee for no reason. I think we definitely need to give some time for a lot of our data scientists to upgrade their infrastructure, Vishesh, Lev, and a whole bunch of others that are working to get these new data sources in. We should wait for exchanges and secondaries and see how that affects the market. We can become familiar with the new governance, and it's kind of the same things we've been hitting in terms of conservatism and safety and moving very slowly. So like to contrast this against what our post-migration goals might be, in the future, we might obviously be optimizing for growth and new products and doing all sorts of fancy things. That's likely not the environment we're in as of today, but it could be something that we get to in the next few weeks or few months. And yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about the trade-offs of our goal setting and what it is that we choose to do. So I mentioned not angering the community with unnecessary stability fee changes. At the same time, in terms of increasing the DSR, we need to be cognizant of the costs that get incurred to the system. A lot of the ideas that have been posted in the forum basically amount to some sort of subsidy from the MKR holders to the community. If that's the direction that we want to go in, we should be able to quantify those costs. I also think that credibility and transparency is a big thing. So, for example, certain people suggesting let's just raise the DSR a lot and then lower it after migration. That's not really a credible plan. It's not going to really incentivize too many people if they know that the DSR is just going to go right back down. And then, actually, probably most importantly, and I don't have time to get into this today, but next week we can start talking about how we might actually set these parameters, kind of the rationale behind the DSR and the stability fee and risk premiums and all that kind of stuff. And that's about it for me today.
Okay, thanks, Cyrus. There's a lot to absorb there as well, so I'll let people collate for a bit. But that loops back to the earlier conversation that we kicked off, where we have a new system in front of us. We need to figure out how to manage this. We have seen some options that Cyrus presented about how we can bite off our immediate short-term work, and that involves how do we pull for a system that we've never pulled for in the past? How do we determine whether we have the empirical data needed to make intelligent decisions? How are we going to bundle up that operational overhead? How do we manage this new system without running the risk of getting too granular and creating weak executives that never get ratified? So those are all the discussions that I'd like to continue in the forums. I'll be posting something, as I said. Cyrus perhaps will be helping me, or he'll be making a post as well, or commenting on it, but we'll make sure that these thoughts have all been summarized so we can continue this discussion. It would be nice to have some kind of general direction in place that we can begin considering for next week. So obviously we can't go without polls for too much longer, because that's not what governance is all about. So we should figure out what the next steps look like. All right.
Quick question.
Go ahead, Cyrus.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm interested in how we would gather consensus for the structure of the poll for Monday.
A great question. So
would that first poll be Monday or some other?
Well, this is where everything gets weird, because it's, who knows who is up. It's up to the community, so we need to figure this out. And so we've been dealing with this we've been enjoying this for a few months now, where the community gets together, comes up with a problem or defines a problem, makes a forum post. That forum post elicits responses. Those responses get collated into a proposal. That proposal turns into another forum post, and then a forum poll gets added to gauge sentiment. If that poll is successful and sentiment is positive, then I move that finalized community language out of the forums and into the governance portal for ratification. So my assumption is that process is going to continue. And so the idea, obviously we're dealing with very, very, very short timelines here. So maybe there isn't a sense of urgency. Maybe we just don't kick off polling for 2 weeks. Maybe we have to do it on Monday. I have no idea how people feel about this, but the idea is that we'll collate all of our ideas, put them into a forum post, add a poll, potentially which option do you like, 1, 2, or 3, or none of the above, and then we'll move on from there. If it turns out that everybody rapidly aligns on one option, then we'll have a path forward. If there's more discussions or better ideas surface, then we'll have to review the calendar. But I cannot predict. All right, I assume that was a satisfying answer for Cyrus. Mr. Deadpan over there. We're going to move on to the next thing. LongForWisdom, do you want to give us a review of what's been happening in the forums?
Yeah, I can do. Do we not want to do Vishesh first? Or?
I don't know which ones. Sure, we can do Vishesh first if you're still scraping the forums and rapidly typing in the text files.
No, I can go now. It's fine. Just
all right. Yeah, feel free to kick it off.
So surprisingly, there haven't actually been that many discussions about MCD in the forums yet. I think most of that has been chat over the last couple of days, which has been cool. So the couple of things that have come up, we had Cyrus lay out the system parameters derivations. So talking about why the migration, like system migration parameters were selected. And some discussion there. I know Mika raised some concerns. So we also had a suggestion about debt ceiling mechanics from Planet X, suggesting a possible improvement for debt ceilings. Basically that the individual debt ceilings be relative to the global debt ceiling rather than like absolute values, which I thought was interesting. A couple of people were talking about that. Also another question about whether MakerDAO will have to abide by Know Your Customer and anti-money laundering laws, following on from some of the FinCEN stuff. So again, that's most of what people have been talking about. One other thing I'd like to point out is that I updated the forum tag index. I renamed it to Forum Navigation Index, and I added some categories to the tags. So it's now hopefully a little bit easier to find your way around the forums and find things.
All right, thanks, L-Dubs. I think I'm calling you now. Thanks, L-Dubs. Vishesh, do you want to take it away and give us the state of the pegs?
Sure. Okay. I think Rich gave a really good preamble where a lot of folks are working on building updated tools for MCD. So apologies, it's gonna be a mess while that all gets cleaned up. But yeah, so to just start off, so with single collateral DAI, this is the last 24 hours or so. You can see we had, a majority of trades still above $1, but there were a few moments where it sort of slipped down a bit and slipped up above a bit as well. So what I've gone through and done is just added a graph here for multi-collateral DAI and one for single collateral DAI. And so we can see here for single collateral DAI, some of those trades below and some of those trades above. So kind of a widespread lately. But honestly, pretty decent trading volume on single collateral DAI, which is good. I think it took 2 or 3 days for some of that trading volume to pick up. Immediately after switchover, it was actually initially very quiet. But a lot of this is actually within the last 24 hours and specifically the tail end of that, which I'll touch on in a moment. Because naturally, just post MCD switchover, you would have, quick movements in ETH price. Because timing works like that. So just to touch on, I have updated my site here. DAI-Peg has also been updated, and there's some slight nuances and differences in the timing methodologies for some of these trades. So you'll see this is showing very, very slightly below $1, and I'm showing very, very slightly above $1. So it's just good to be aware of those differences. There are also some nuances in what the granularity is for ETH prices from Coinbase and stuff like that. So that's what leads to some of these kinds of differences. Multi-collateral DAI, so very light on the trading so far. There were a few trades a little bit below $1. A decent chunk of the trading has been above $1, and then very, very recently there were a few more large trades slightly below $1. Right at switchover, it was trading a bit below, but that just kind of evened out over time. I think that was just some of the bumpiness from switchover. So you can see here, this is that multi-collateral DAI price graph. So a decent chunk above $1, a few large trades below, but overall, what I'm seeing is slightly less trading below $1 than above. And again, this trading volume was much lower, say 48 hours ago, but has picked up slightly just in the last few hours. And then again, DIPEG showing some of those trades. I think their window goes back a little bit further, so they're picking up some of these larger trades that were below $1 in their account. So they're showing again slightly below, but there are nuances that we can all dive into in how those ETH prices are sourced and how the implied volume weighted average price is calculated, and we can all dive into that if we like. So just bigger picture with single collateral DAI. I'll rename all this stuff to go through and rename a bajillion references to DAI to be Psi. But yeah, so what we saw was, that run up in supply leading up to migration, which I think we called the shot pretty well, that was some hoarding behavior. And then just after switchover, we saw maybe 3 or 4 million DAI being wiped, another 2 or 3 million DAI being wiped, and then about 2 being drawn out, and then again about 3 being wiped. So just in the 48 hours or so after migration, we saw the supply drop from about 102 million to about 96. So 6 million or so drop. And then in the last few hours, there's actually been a further drop to just above 92 million. And we'll touch on that in a sec. So here you can see that drop from about 101 to 96. And then just very, very recently down to a little over 92 million. So this is single collateral DAI. Sentiment also needs to do their naming update. But yeah, so part of that was you see net. So there was about 3 million wiped and about 1.5 million drawn out in the last few hours. Net about 1.8 million wiped. So there was also a drop in ETH price, funny enough, to just below 160 in the last few hours. And that led to some liquidations as well. So that's just added layer of complexity on some of the switchover stuff. So it'll be curious to see how liquidations impact SCD versus MCD in the migration timeframe, because those will naturally drop the SCD supply. So it'll be curious to see if people bounce back and then switch back over and get into MCD, but if liquidations speeding up migration or not, that will be interesting to watch. So yeah, as far as some of the rates, so we saw the stability fee at 5%, and we saw the compound SCD supply rate. So this is interesting because we want to watch how it compares to DSR. We saw the compound SCD supply rate sitting, well below that. Stability fee has come back up above. So that's, again, we're into this curious time frame where the rate that you can get for supplying assets to compound is higher than the cost of having that single collateral DAI. So this persisting could potentially slow down migration. So it'll be interesting to watch this. But right now, this is theoretically still a more attractive rate than the DSR at 2%. So that's an interesting data point. So as far as those volumes, we did see, actually before migration started, we saw the compound borrow volumes drop, and they've just kind of held flat since then. The supply volumes dropped as well just before migration, and have actually kind of held flat as well. So it's interesting. You would expect to see more of a dip, I think, in these borrow and supply volumes post-migration. So this is actually just kind of holding a little bit stickier than expected. So that's also potentially contributing to some of the slowness of migration. And then, yeah, so this is just the resulting graph that excess supply is actually more or less net the same of where it was. So what's cool is for Compound, their utilization rate came up a little bit with those drops and is more or less net where it was before migration started. So at the moment, that just appears to be another contributor to some of the speed of migration. But yeah, so as Cyrus mentioned, there's about 12.8 million multi-collateral DAI out there, and about 0.7 million sitting in the DSR, pulling in that 2% rate. So it'll be curious to see how attractive this rate is in contributing to the amount sitting in the DSR. But currently it looks like you would need to have a slightly higher rate for the current market conditions to really speed up that migration. So that's maybe a discussion topic for people. Yeah, so again, this is just that circulating supply. So at school, we've seen about 1.5 million, or sorry, 150,000 multi-collateral DAI transacted upon in the last 3 days. So that's a cool number to watch, is just how that transaction volume of multi-collateral DAI compares to single collateral DAI. And that's something that maybe we can dive into next time when we have a little bit more infrastructure built around multi-collateral DAI data. Cool. So I will stop there and see if I'm sure there's some questions. Well, Matthew was asking about how compound migration is going to work. I think Cyrus answered that that's over the next couple of weeks. Yeah, okay.
Have they made any like statements about that? I mean, I feel like they've been like the only quiet person in regards to multi-collateral DAI migration.
Yeah, he posted in our forum that they were getting ready to do it soon, but we've also been, so they've been public about it, but we've also been in contact with them and we've heard the same.
Cool.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Vishesh. Actually, yeah, in chat, not forum. I want to talk a little bit about incentives, actually, for the DSR, because I think this is maybe an interesting conversation right now. So right now, both the SAI and the DAI price are stable, roughly, assuming that we can trust the liquidity and the trade volume and so forth. So technically, the system is fine right now, and the migration is still underway. It's still progressing nicely, but eventually that will slow down. And so the natural response from a lot of people is to raise the DSR to incentivize more SAI holders to switch over. But I mean, as I'm sure you guys know already, is that if we're stable right now and we increase the DSR, then DAI may not still be at $1, right? In theory, it should be slightly higher. And then so that increase in DSR would need to be offset somehow. And to offset the increase in demand, you would have to logically increase the supply, which basically means having to lower the stability fee for DAI, basically converging the spread of the DSR and the stability fee. And what's interesting about that is that would essentially amount to a subsidy of sorts, because now system is earning less in stability fee and paying more in DSR. So this is kind of one of the topics that I was referring to earlier, is that we need to be aware of these kinds of complex dynamics. And yeah, I mean, first I'd like to kind of hear some thoughts. I know Matthew in the chat has been vocal about this as well. I want to see if anybody else has any thoughts on this kind of thinking.
So, I mean, just as a point of note as well, we would only be subsidizing if there was like 100% usage of the DSR, right? So obviously we can't ensure that there's not going to be, but if it's like 5%, then it's.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, so it doesn't even necessarily need to be, subsidy doesn't even need to mean that the system is losing money. It could simply mean that it's earning less than it should. And what it should be earning is related to what that spread should sit at, the DSR, in the DSR versus a stability fee, which we can talk about next week as well. Or I'm planning to talk about next week, and obviously talk about it now as well. But yeah, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is if we're going to start changing the DSR this week, which I think, in my opinion, is probably too early, it would, I mean, logically, it would have to be combined with an offsetting change somewhere else as well, right? And so this kind of goes back to the poll structure, in that logically it may make sense to combine certain types of packages with the parameters. The utilization rate of the DSR is also tricky, because if you increase the DSR, then logically the utilization rate would go up, right? And we have no idea right now.
Yeah, we don't know how much, right?
How much it would go up. So right now there's only 6% of dies locked up. The DSR goes up to 4%. It could be 25% for all we know.
One of those things would be good to like gather data on, right? To see what sort of change prompts what sort of effect.
Right.
I have some governance related thoughts I can discuss if no one else has got anything.
Yeah, please do. What's going on?
Yeah, so talking about like the executive bundling again, which I know is everyone's favorite topic. So the technical changes, like the patches to the flopper and things, they're going to have to go into an executive vote, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, two of them, right? The MKR authority thing does not need to be put to an executive vote, because it's the that owns that.
Yes. So go ahead.
My kind of thing is, so even more so than like combined, like bundling rate changes, bundling technical changes with rate changes seems like a whole load of bad idea. Like,
well,
can we like
bad is a strong word. But
no, it's
here,
bad.
Here's
no, it's bad because we like the recent rate change, right, passed with like 970 maker. So like, and by bundling that with then like this required patch, we were then saying that like, yeah, okay, we're just taking that just because, essentially, right?
Yeah, I agree, and I think that this is something that we've been talking about in these calls for a while, at least more often in the last few weeks, but over the course of the last year, I think. And the idea that the system made perfect sense conceptually if we lived in a world that was very simple, where we had a single stability fee and a single executive. Even then, we ran into some complexities actually, where we just naturally assumed that people would ratify these executives immediately, and we wouldn't have to worry about it. And one day they didn't, and so we had two polls, and we didn't know which one the executive was referring to which executive. So stress cracks are going to form very rapidly, and this raises some significant questions that need to be answered. How do we handle a roll-up executive in a continuous approval model, where it's potential and probably even likely that we're going to have mutually exclusive and or contentious signals wrapped up in the same executive? That's going to be a big issue that needs to be addressed. I don't know what the solution is right now. The second major thing that's just happened and we need to internalize as well is that it's very important that we understand that we can look at governance from two different perspectives. One is it's an economy where we have parameters, and we massage those parameters until the ecosystem comes back in line and becomes stable. We also are managing a software package, and this is where things get a bit weird. because you can easily conceptualize the protocol as being an application. It's just a really big, immutable, freaky, decentralized one, but it's still an app. And what we do in these calls is we are in the governance ecosystem, not in these calls. In the governance ecosystem, we determine what the configuration of that application is, and then we, once that app configuration is ratified, it gets the application gets updated. That is the software model, and in the software model, that's a useful way of thinking about this, because software has bugs and software needs to be updated. And so, do we vote on security upgrades? Do we vote on emergency deploys? Which software upgrades do we vote on? Which monetary policy issues do we vote on, and why, and in what situations are those votes not required? So those are going to be some really interesting discussions we need to dig into. So, and we've touched on them in the past a few times, where people who are unfamiliar with the system ask questions like, MakerDAO did something, did you vote on that? And the answer 9 times out of 10 is no, because we don't vote on everything here. We vote on risk parameters that manage the system, and as we mature, more and more of those parameters get exposed to the ecosystem. So the question becomes, how do we manage that expectation? We can't vote on every upgrade to the system. We can't vote on every emergency deploy that fixes a critical bug, because for a whole host of reasons we probably don't have time to get into, but number one reason is that you don't telegraph the exploit in your system and then wait around while other people exploit it while you talk about whether everybody thinks you should fix it or not. Like, that's not the way you maintain a secure system. So frequently we're going to have to deploy contracts and then talk about it afterwards. Other times, like the situation we're in right now, where a potential exploit has been discovered that is not enormously time sensitive, which will, we do have the luxury of putting that to a vote and discussing it ahead of time. But yeah, I see your point, Long. It's like mixing and matching these things into a single yes or no question at the end of a week is, I can't see that lasting much longer.
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of points. As far as I understand, like with the system as it is, like in order to actually upgrade the smart contracts, we need, like, it requires an executive vote, right? Like, we can't not vote on that.
Some of them, yes, but that's also not cut and dry. Some of them you need to empower the contracts to do things, and in order to empower them, you need to cast a spell, and to cast a spell, you need to have a vote. Other times, you just replace the contract and you're off to the races.
So is tomorrow's executive vote fixing the flopper bug? Is that for tomorrow?
Yes.
So yeah, can we not bundle that with like can we just like declare at this point that we're not going to bundle like rate changes and like monetary policy changes with technical changes?
We could say that, but I'm not entirely sure we have the capacity to actually do it, because we can't have multiple executives, we can't have multiple hats, right?
So, I mean, I think we've talked about this a little bit in the past, where we want to make the polls the actual decision-making venue, and have the executives then just be the kind of deployment.
The roll-up.
That's semantics at that point, though, isn't it? Like we're saying that like the poll is a signal, but then we change our minds and say that's no, the poll
that's
is the decision. But either way, we still have a single yes no at the end of the week, right?
We have to transition away from the poll being the signal and have the poll be the vote, right?
Yeah, it's certainly an option, but then at that point, it's not a poll anymore. So we should just say that we have votes, and then later on we have a different vote.
The problem is you can't separate them. Like, it has to be 2 votes, right? Like, you have to have the poll first, which then, like, say there's 2 polls, like one wins like 100%, one, like the other side wins the other one 100%. Like, both those sides have then got to vote through the executive, right? And if the losing side like doesn't want like that thing enough, then they will just not vote for the executive if it includes other things which they like maybe do want. Like, you can't move it all to the polls, because it comes into one combined like executive thing that needs to pass for changes to happen.
Yeah, I agree. And it also increases what I was talking about earlier, this operational overhead, which is a significant issue for us. So frankly, we saw already that 950 Maker came out to change the stability fee. And that was on because we had another poll or we had another poll and another vote that was far more sexy, and everybody ignored the old boring stability fee. So what happens if we have 3 or 4 of these things a week? What's the likelihood of people showing up and voting for those?
I think that the problem is just the narrative, right? So when you say that the polling vote is just signaling that people just don't care enough because they don't think the stakes are high.
Sure, yeah, I can see your point.
But they shouldn't be high, because if every few days or we have too many executive votes, then the MKR gets split amongst them, and it decreases security.
Well, this is a strategy to reduce the number of executive votes, right? If you're making an executive vote purely for deployment, then you only have executives say, I don't know.
Oh, you're right. I was saying about Rich's idea. I mean, yeah, I got it.
Thing is, the polls like don't have stakes. Like, it's all good to say, like, you know, they should have stakes and things, but they actually don't, because they don't control the system. The executive does. Like, you can sort of say that, like, oh yeah, whatever we vote will then go into the executive, but people don't have to vote for the executive, so they can just register their disapproval at that stage. It's not ideal, but like that's kind of the way the system's built, right?
Also, the technical ones I think are going to be, well, hopefully should be very far and few in between. So I think it's, and I do think technical executive votes should be separate, because that's like an extreme perversion of the bundling, where you have to accept something that you don't want, because otherwise you're gonna allow a technical bug to persist. I think that's pretty much not cool.
This is kind of my point, right?
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think that the technical fixes should be very rare. And I think we should just focus on fixing our regular bundling problem, which is probably easier to fix.
Yeah, but this is, sorry, I keep on hammering this home, but we've had all these discussions and we've had a few good ideas, and some of those are good ideas I've already forgotten, and we need to formalize this thing. So that has to be in the forum thread. Let's get a working group of dedicated people together to solicit the community, to solicit the internal org. And that includes you, Nick, and anybody else from the foundation that's in the call. We want to hear from you as well, to figure out exactly what it is we can do to improve the system and start iterating on it, because I'm going to keep on repeating it, that the stress cracks are going to form, and I'm not confident that the tooling that we have right now is going to get us through the next 6 months. Even the conceptual tooling that we have is not going to get us through the next 6 months. So we need to figure out how to address these situations and provide some deeper thought into the solutions as well, because we've been bitten by this in the past, where we've debated for a couple months in the forums, we've come up with a solution, we've implemented that solution, and almost immediately realized we forgot 2 edge cases.
So can we delay the executive vote for the most recent stability fee change?
I have no idea. Like, this is all completely uncharted territory, this group should know that I'm have a significant amount of reservation about making any kind of arbitrary decisions. It's not my place to do that. So I can't just say, oh, you know, it's weird that we're just not going to do a stability fee poll this week. Happily, I have no concern of brand damage, but the fallout would be enormous. So, the community has to figure out some way to signal their intention to do things like that in a coordinated manner that's auditable and visible, and then I am happy to do whatever they want to do. But I can't just decide we're not going to have a poll this week, or a vote this week.
So I guess if I'd known about this like a week before, I would have like made a forum poll and things and said, please don't bundle the technical changes with the voluntary policy changes. But I only found out about the technical changes like today. And
yeah. Aaron says,
I found out about them 2 days ago. So.
Aaron says, why don't we make a precedent or mandate for this situation? And the answer is we keep coming up on new edge cases. Well, we can't make a precedent for every type of
yeah. the branching complexity of what it is we might encounter here is significant, and the time and effort it would take to try and cover off those things has been more than we can handle internally, especially with the launch of MCD. But if the community wants to get together and start coming up with some models of how this thing can go wrong and ways that we could respond to that, I'd be enormously interested in helping out. But these are all things that we need to capture formally. And I talked about the forums, and that might not sound super satisfying when it comes to complicated software project management. But we're going to get into this more in the next call and the call afterwards, that we need to start treating some of these initiatives as if they were grown-up business projects. And how that's going to happen is not only discussion in the forums, but we also have project docs that explain exactly what this specific change is all about. And we're going to start talking about ticketing systems and GitHubs and commits and coordination and assigning tickets to people, and using some more sophisticated tooling than a forum thread to sort of propel this thing into the next level. Because ultimately, the yeah, sorry, Long. I'm not saying we're not doing a forum thread, but the forum thread is the first step, and after that, we start moving into some more sophisticated project management tools, so we can track this thing. Because it is ultimately what we are dealing with is a software package with configuration parameters. We can use the tools that have been, and the processes that have been devised to manage those kinds of things. That was a great point, though. I don't know if you've received a satisfying answer, LongForWisdom, but I have very few completely satisfying answers to deliver. It's up to the community and the foundation to get together and come up with a plan and then start to formalize that.
Yep, you're right.
All right, cool. We had a lot of things to talk about in this call. We also had a lot of things to talk about that we didn't get to. We have a bunch of migration stuff happening. We have a bunch of ecosystem actors that are in various stages of upgrades. You didn't miss the boat. So if you do have questions you want to ask, please join us in chat at chat.makerdao.com or in forums at forum.makerdao.com. And let's continue this conversation. There's lots of super smart people with super smart ideas, and it's hypercritical that we start recording them, or we continue to record them and act on them. All right, I think that might be it, unless there's any last minute. What's that?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm just curious. Does anyone feel strongly about the DSR one way or another? Like if there were to be a vote right now, does anyone feel like
whether it should go up or down or stay the same?
Or stay the same, or no opinion, or feel strongly about something? I'm just curious.
I don't think we can really increase it high enough to make a huge difference with.
Am I allowed to vote?
No.
I think that, well, I've been staring at graphs for a long time. They're not money graphs, but I'm staring at computer graphs, and we just did something big 2.5 days ago. It freaks me out that there'd be any kind of an intention to change things based on 2.5 days of empirical evidence. But maybe
furthermore, the empirical data of, I mean, the DSR is a monetary policy tool. The question is, what is the peg? If it's materially off in a way we can see completely, then yeah, we would change it. But right now, I don't see that either.
I think there's been like this other camp that's been thinking about changing the DSR for the sake of increasing the side to die migration.
Right.
I think that's the only like thing that's really bogging it down from the monetary policy side.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
I share Cyrus's reservation though that
I think it's more like a tool at the moment.
Sorry, Vishesh, you cut out for a second.
Yeah, I was saying at the moment, I don't think it's going to have a huge impact on monetary policy, especially considering like what the MCD supply is. I think it's more about, do you need to do that to speed up migration or not? And it's early to say that.
Right. So
yeah, I echo Cyrus's concerns though, because if we say to the community, oh, okay, we're going to increase the tastiness of this carrot briefly in order to lure you over to this other ecosystem. It's not a long-term strategy. Anybody with they're going to realize that that's not
Right. So what if somehow the community committed to it not being temporary, and would that cost be worth the offset in? Can you quantify the cost of a slower migration such that it might be worth it to increase the DSR for a sustained amount of time, like almost just very transparently, basically a subsidy?
Well, so
Right,
just
but
for like as far as like time frames go, I don't think you necessarily need to just presuppose that like if the DSR is not permanently going to be higher, that nobody's going to take advantage of it. Because I think the people that are supplying, for example, DAI to Compound right now are doing so to get whatever is the best rate at the moment. Now, inevitably, as migration proceeds, borrow volumes on platforms like Compound should decrease as well, which should further incentivize migration. So it's really actually more of a sequencing question, I think. And so at the end of the day, if you know that those rates will eventually drop, it's not a question of do you need a permanent increase in rates? It's a question of are you worried about the pace and do you need to accelerate the dropping of those rates and the decrease of that supply?
Well, the other thing that I'm concerned about too is that we don't understand what the DSR is. Like I've been beating that drum for a long time. Conceptually, we've all read the same docs, but how the ecosystem reacts to it and who's interested is I'm still unclear on. So we don't know whether this is a retail, it's attractive to retail users, or is this something that exchanges and large holders or major apps are going to be interested in to subsidize their own operations. And if that's the case, then maybe a conservative DSR is exactly what they need. And retail can go to the secondary lending platforms.
So I would agree with you that like moving forward, we don't have a clear eye on what the key use case will be for the DSR, but like there is a system that exists right now. And I think the DSR at the moment is just absorbing some proxy percentage of the existing like use cases. And so right now, the existing use cases appear to primarily be like individual users that purchase up certain amounts of DAI and lend it out to achieve some kind of like relatively risk-free yield. And so I think that's the most comparable use case today. I don't know what happens in the future.
Yeah, I think another point to follow on with that, and Cyrus, to your question about a migration, if we increase the DSR to just kind of temporarily motivate people, everybody likes free money, it's alpha. There's nothing that stops it from people going right back and recycling. It's not a one-way migration.
Well,
until we
sort of actually.
But imagine we drop, I'm not suggesting we do this, but if we dropped the debt ceiling in Psi all the way to 0, then increase the DSR, that would be a forcible migration. That's how you would force people to go one side or the other. We're just not
sure,
there.
but that's
I don't think
fairly aggressive at that point.
Agreed.
So Taylor from the chat asks, what are
actually, let's find out if Taylor has a mic. Taylor, did you want to ask your question then? Or do you want us to read it out for you?
Yeah. So, my opinion is that the DSR can have certain impacts on certain people who are like literally only financially incentivized. But I think that what you're saying right now is that there's other things that we can do to increase migration speed that would probably have a bigger effect than the DSR, especially for those random retail people that, have opened a CDP over time. But, if we're going to talk about the DSR, then, do we have data on that? And is there a financial downside to a slow migration? And, has there been research on past changes to the DSR that you can use to influence or help make this decision? Because just like on a very little level, right? Like if you can say that a slow migration will cost you $1 million, then you can very easily say, well, let's spend $900,000 to increase the speed. That's obviously, it's much more complex than that, but that's just one little thing.
Yeah, well, Rich has been the #1 fear monger of a slow migration. I guess I'm up there too. No, we don't know how to quantify the costs there, but behind the scenes for kind of managing the polls and the executive votes and everything is an insanely complicated process. Those are like 40 steps or something, Rich, when you built that sequencing timeline of what it takes to do 1 week's worth of polling, and it requires
Yeah, and
cross-functional
after-
work from like 8 different divisions in the org to get everything going.
Yeah, so the operational overhead is definitely a thing, but Taylor brought up some interesting points. Attempting to quantify the cost of a slow migration is a really interesting question, which we should be giving some additional thought to if we haven't already.
What's your hourly rate, Rich? Let's start there.
How bad do you want it? My hourly rate is that I work 18 hours a day.
Right? Like at the end of the day, it's about, right, as and Kunkel said, like managing 2 systems. That's probably your biggest risk or cost, is something goes wrong from the fact that you're managing 2 systems.
Yeah, well, there's the technical risk or the economic risk, financial risk. There's also internal costs, which actually would be far easier to quantify. How much does it cost the foundation itself to manage all this stuff? Which is an interesting question, but it's so much more complex than that. The large segments of the ecosystem haven't decided if they want to shut down SCD yet. And if they do, when do they want that to happen? So encouraging these migrations could be counter to the will of the holders, or it could be, who knows? There's all kinds of things happening.
And we don't have any meaningful data or research yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Rich's original point still stands. Like, it's been 3 days. Like, why are we rushing to change things?
That's why I keep on talking about this Brave New World thing, is like, and how do we kick off voting and polling again, and what do we poll on, because we have a vacuum of actionable data to use. So as part of the migration strategy that was outlined by Cyrus's team, the order of the day is due diligence, caution, and sane defaults, and then wait and see what happens so we can remain responsive to these emerging pressures we don't understand. And then over time, we begin to put additional governance pieces back into this puzzle. And I think that how we do that is, I don't want to, like I said, grandfather in those old processes. So now is the time for us all to come together and figure out, here's the list of all the things we want to do better. And here's the things that should be changed, and make sure that's formalized. So when we do get back into having to actively manage the system with the data and models that were trustable, we know how to do it.
So taking it back for a minute to an old topic, scientific governance, like it will be interesting to learn the impact of the DSR on different stats in the system. And I think it will be hard to do that if you are changing multiple variables at a time. So I think that's a topic for us to consider, and that's why I'm bringing this up, is what variables do we want to change when, and how do we choose which ones are most important to learn about?
So
that's why I'm usually cautious, but that's why I'm so excited about Cyrus's long-term plan. So he accused me of
being I know, but that's also
number.
But that's also scares me about any data we do have so far, because I mean, my idea is to obviously keep the spread between DSR and stability fee somewhat constant, and then shift those 2 parameters up and down as we need for the peg. But that makes a lot of the data we have thus far kind of unusable. I mean, at least hard to draw meaningful signal on. Because in the past, if we needed a 2% change in the stability fee, now it may just be 1 and 1 on the DSR and stability fee, or 0.5 and 1.5. We're going to need to kind of reset our data collection. Not reset.
Well, that's presupposing that the spread between the DSR and the stability fee is what you want to like manage for keeping constant.
But I think we do actually. Well, I mean, this is open for discussion, but based on kind of the work we've been doing, you could make an argument that the quality or the characteristics of the collateral shouldn't change on a week-to-week basis, but maybe that's like a spread that we can change on a month-to-month or even a quarterly basis, barring any emergency changes to.
Yeah, it seems like any solution to optimize cost, it's the traditional triangle, right? Like pick 2. So if we optimize, then we lose some flexibility. And that's one of my major concerns, that if we say, here's the spread that, or here's a poll where you guys can pick what spread you guys want, from -4 to +4, is great, because it wraps up. It's like a mini algorithm. We can just wrap that up into the other 5 levers and then spit out a number, and that's it, 1 vote. but it reduces flexibility. So what if one of those things goes haywire and we're used to doing this single poll every week, and suddenly we need to do some rapid triage to figure out what just happened? That system is not going to work anymore.
Well, so this was also a long preempted conversation, like from maybe 6 months ago, which was when something goes wrong, how do you determine the root cause and how do you determine the right lever to adjust? And so my suggestion, like not just for my own like ease of analysis, but also in general for managing the system, is especially right now when information is so scarce and there's the potential to mess something up. I would strongly suggest only changing one thing at a time.
So Taylor just posted a link to one of my least favorite graphs in the world.
Yeah, so this is the DAO, the DAO's withdrawal contract balance over time. And this may, like, I'm not a researcher, but I'm sure someone who does like research in data analytics may be able to draw conclusions from this. But basically what we're seeing is, the DAO is an interesting thing to look at because there's a very strong financial incentive for people to withdraw their ETH, right? And it's similar to the migration that we're dealing with now, in the fact that people had to go through steps that were somewhat complex. There wasn't really a sense of urgency, but the financial incentive was insane, right? Because your DAO tokens had essentially no value. And if you put your DAO tokens in this contract, you got ETH back, which had a value. And so anyway, what we see is obviously the long tail is super long, but the primary migration happened, say, between July 15th and September 15th. So that may give us an idea of how long, at minimum, the bulk of this migration may take.
Do you know what percentage is still locked up there?
It's actually super small. So the balance of the withdrawal contract right now is 1.142 billion, but the total supply is 1.153 billion. So relatively speaking, it's like, yeah.
But I mean, from the original amount that was in there, like what percentage of people have withdrawn?
Oh, I could pull that data, or who would have that data is Baki. I'll see what he has in his GitHub and I'll go in the Rocket and post it. But, I would say that just looking at this, you can probably assume that you're going to be looking at 3 months for the bulk of the migration. But it would also be interesting to track this graph next to the side diagram to see if it's following the same pattern.
Yeah, they didn't have exchanges. It's going to go faster.
There's a lot of key differences. Like one, the DAO had basically one interface, or Kraken. I think that was it. Where obviously there's a lot more. It's much more diverse today, which is both a positive and a negative. The other key difference, though, is that the community and the communication forums for the DAO were very centralized. Like all communications happen in Slack and on Reddit for pretty much the entire ecosystem, right? Where today the international community is much larger. You have a much more diverse population of retail versus not retail, right? And I think that I would assume that the migration in this case would be slower than the DAO, simply because of that, just the expanding nature of the ecosystem and how hard it is to reach the different audiences and convince them to migrate.
It depends on how you want to measure that, though. Like, I think my expectation is that we're going to slowly ramp up, and then there'll be a tipping point where people are sort of rushing for the exit. There's going to be some additional pressures as people watch circulating supply go down. But it's going, like any kind of migration, it'll tail off at this point where who knows what the percentage is. Like 10% is just never going to move. It's either abandoned or disinterested. So migrations have a tendency to, significant volume would move, but then it's never going to end, really, unless there's an emergency or a global settlement, emergency shutdown, whatever it is we're calling it these days.
Yeah, exactly. I would be really interested in seeing, so like, I mean, a large bulk of, if you just look at the graph, a large bulk of the migration for the DAO happened within the first 5 days. Now, some of that was further incentivized by the fact that ETC came into existence, which meant that every whale was suddenly like, you know, had this sort of external pressure to get their shit out, right? But still, I mean, a large bulk happened, let's see, July 15th to say like August 5th. And then it trickled off, and then, you know, now we're at the very, very long tail. But it's just, it's super interesting to look at this data. I'm sure you could pull even more interesting data points about this and compare it to where we are now and draw some, I don't know, random or not so random conclusions from it.
So, Rich, I just did some math. If we increase the DSR to 10% and drop the stability fee to 0 on MCD, it'll cost us less than 900 grand a month. Pretty sure that would get a lot of migration going. What do you think?
Did you just roll your 20-sided die to figure out our monetary policy? Is that what you thought?
No, I'm just putting some numbers into context. Like,
yeah. Oh, it's a very interesting conversation. Like, we need
like
to
put it this way:
quantify.
if we think it's going to take 3 months, because of that's what's happened in other somewhat similar situations, then at least puts a bound on it.
Sure, but it's so complicated. Like, we come back because you were half joking, but not really. Like, my entire universe is what goes wrong next. What goes wrong next? And so, at this a slow, orderly walk, saunter towards the exits from one system to the other is what I'm hoping for. And if we say like, hey, like we fire off some flares, throw out some firecrackers, and say that there's free candy in the next 10, like, who knows how the ecosystem is going to behave, right? So,
yeah, but I was kind of hinting at it before, but I mean, let's imagine just, again, hypothetical crazy numbers, you make it 50%. People will definitely migrate over, but that doesn't necessarily imply that they wouldn't shut everything down on Psi unless you're reducing the debt ceiling on the single collateral side such that that die can't move back ever again, and you're effectively killing off one to force the migration to the other. Let's imagine it was 50% and you had a bunch of people migrate, and then you dropped it back down to 2% and said, surprise, well, they may just very well go back.
No, but the Psi will be gone. But Matthew, the Psi would be gone from the CDP migration by that point. So it's effective. It is technically a two-way, but the reverse is constrained by liquidity, which would likely not be there.
Starting a Cold War with all the secondary lending platforms. So all the people that had Psi would just say, let's go to 16% and compound now.
So this goes back to what I was trying to say in my presentation earlier, is that we can't really be reactionary for too much longer, and we have to start making really business-oriented decisions, which technically isn't my job. I mean, I can basically lay out the different options and quantify their impacts, but this is like a community has to somehow start defining business objectives, business goals, and that's not something easy, especially when governance can at times be apathetic. Like, this is probably a better use of delegation than the voting on the parameters, is like a delegation for business objectives. Like, how do we actually want to go forward on this or tinker with this?
Actually, yeah, that's a very interesting conversation, because potentially that could be, it's kind of a rock that I've been hesitant to turn over, because it's obviously, like you said, it's the community's job to kind of do a lot of this stuff, but it's kind of also our job to guide the way a bit. But maybe a reminder or a recap. Maybe we need to have a business analyst in here every once in a while to just say like, hey, this is what these rates might do to the protocol, and here's what our suggestions are or something. Do we need a distributed business team at some point? It's so complicated. Until then, Cyrus, we're just going to rely on you, I think, to do it for us. He's a great big sigh. All right, we went significantly over time today, and usually I do everything I can to shut it down, but this one was fairly spicy, so thanks everyone for all of the great conversations, all the great questions. There was a lot to absorb, and as I've said numerous times, we'll do our best to condense everything and post it to the forum. So look for the working group from governance about how to improve governance. Look for 2, possibly 3 posts from the tech teams explaining the fixes and alterations that need to go out this week. Also, please consider voting, because right now somebody with 950 Maker is setting monetary policy for us, and we can't allow that to continue. So please come out and vote and help us shape the future of the MakerDAO. All right, thanks everybody.